All right. Well, hey, just really appreciate the opportunity today. Can you hear me okay?
Again,
All right, great. Yeah, well, for those of you that don't know me, my role is kind of unique. I tell folks I'm like Tigger. I'm the only one. I serve as a U.S. Forest Service liaison for DOD. Had a long history, 15 years working with DOD wildland fires. So I'm kind of connected between both agencies and DOD. Well, a couple of things about DOD. One, I think they're the agency that uses more acronyms than the wildland fire world. So I find myself being an acronym translator sometimes. So have to throw a few out on the first slide here. So CERTIP and ESTCP are DoD's environmental research organizations, and over about the past 10 to 12 years, actually closer to 15 years, uh, CERTIP and ESTCP have funded what's come to be known as the DoD Wildland Fire Science Initiative. And I say DoD because DOW is another acronym that I'm not quite ready to add to the vernacular here. So anyway, the DoD Wildland Fire Science Initiative. My slides to change here. DoD Wildland Fire Science Initiative is driven really by prescribed fire more than wildfire. Actually, much of the DoD investment through CERTIP and ESTCP has been in the realm of what we're calling prescribed fire science. And the reason for that is simple. Necessity being the mother of invention, uh, Department of Defense has probably more creative ways to start wildfires than most folks can even imagine. And the DoD test and training ranges are the most wildfire prone landscapes in North America. Uh, like I say, I worked at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and I could tell you stories over a beer about all the amazing different ways that DoD can start wildfires. So DoD does prescribed burning at a massive scale compared on an acre per acre basis to any of the other federal agencies, including U.S. Forest Service. Um, Actually, by an order of magnitude on a per acre basis, and that's you know partly for reducing the risk from wildfire, but also because DoD, because it has a lot of wildfires on its property, uh, ends up harboring a lot of fire dependent endangered species. And the Endangered Species Act is another driver for really aggressive prescribed fire programs, especially in the Southeast and Eastern United States. So I just wanted to provide that as a little bit of context before we jump in. And of course, the science for prescribed fire has a tremendous amount of overlap with wildfire science. But as being in the eastern United States, most of you realize, west of the United States is where about 90% of the federal lands are, including U.S. Forest Service lands. So, historically, that's where the research has been, and the focus has been on wildfire. And it's interesting, a lot of people don't realize the fire behavior models that are in common use right now within all the federal agencies and many of the state agencies, Farsight, et cetera, are actually based on a 1972 mathematical equation, something called Rothermel's equation. And it's served the fire community well for something that's very quick to run, for wildfire response from a single point source ignition. It's gotten better over the years, but it was never intended to be able to uh, model fire behavior, interactions between different flaming fronts, that sort of thing. And in the prescribed fire world, as we all know, it's fuels, weather, topography are all going to affect fire behavior, but also the ignition pattern selected by the burn boss. That's the kind of the one part of the equation that uh, you know the human being has control over. They can control the ignition pattern in order to moderate or increase the intensity of the burn. So prescribed fire science, requires these next generation fire behavior models and smoke models that can actually model those interactions between flaming fronts, individual multiple ignition sources, like helicopter ignition, that sort of thing. And the only way to study those and to really start providing data to feed these models for validation is by pre-planning prescribed fires and pulling a bunch of scientists in to set up instrumentation and measure all the different aspects of that fire through these collaborative research campaigns. As you can see in the bottom, and a little bit about the diagram here, the gray ovals are things that happen, kind of stages in these model development, and the rectangles, kind of the mustard or tan colored rectangles, are products that are coming from this. So these prescribed fire research campaigns, I'll talk more about those as we go through, but there have been a number of them, and many of them have taken place on Department of Defense land, starting actually with the RX Cadre experiments, which were at Eglin Air Force Base back in 2012 when I served as the Wildland Fire Program Manager there at Eglin. But there have been a number of them, some that you may have heard of. But from these campaigns, they're collecting data on fire behavior, fire effects, consumption, heat release, smoke, high fidelity weather, also ignition parameters. Actually, have GoPros on the helicopter and hand ignition, so they are getting the exact timing of the ignition pattern, number of ignition spheres that are dropped per acre by the helicopter as it goes. Also, three-dimensional fuels is a real important part of that, which feeds into something called fast fuels that we talk about, which now has a nation, well, actually the lower 48 states are now covered by this three-dimensional fast fuels, which is available through land fire data layer. I'll talk more about quick fire, which is one of these next generation physics-based fire models that is now able to run on a laptop computer. It doesn't require the supercomputers that some of the earlier, more complex physics-based models like FireTech required. So we'll talk about quick fire and how it's being used in the model development and testing, and also feeding into something called Y-Fire Commons, which feeds into something called Burn Pro 3D. And I won't have time to get into all of that, but I will provide some links in the last slide for those that want to do a deeper dive into some of these models. But anyway, so that's kind of the way that these things work. But these collaborative research campaigns are the basis for gathering the data that goes into the validation of these models. And I would also add, for those of you that are online, hopefully you can see my slides. And I would encourage you, if you've got any questions, just pop them in the chat. And I hope to have some time for the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Yeah, so I mentioned fast fuels, and this is an example of a fast fuels tile. Fast fuel is actually three-dimensional fuel model. That's what's required for these next generation fire models. It's based on forest inventory analysis, the FIA data, as well as the surface fuels from Scott and Bergen. I mentioned now available for the lower 48. If you go into land fire, you can click on an area, you can pull up the fast fuels data. So the fidelity of it varies, but it can, as far as what's available in land fire, some areas that have like used the LiDAR scanning and that are working closely with some of the researchers have some, really high resolution fuels data like the tile that I'm showing here. But it is available as a starting point in land fire now to be able to feed into these next generation fire behavior models. Yeah, so I mentioned these collaborative research burns. This is just a snapshot of one of the earlier ones that we did at Fort Stewart, Georgia. Had 39 scientists from 9 different organizations, 10 different assertive projects, these DoD-funded projects where they took measurements on 3 burn units totaling a little under 3,000 acres, all aerial ignition burns, looking at infrared, multispectral tower, high-resolution aircraft imagery, satellite imagery. I mentioned the ignition patterns and timing, measured total heat flux, also those spread rates and patterns. And prior to the burns, I mentioned those terrestrial LiDAR scans, also had airborne LiDAR scans, and backed those up with traditional sampling, for quality control on those. Number of different things on smoke measurements, looking at chemistry, particulate concentration, also 3D plume characterization, which is really interesting. It can show the vorticity inside the plumes, lift, turbulence, and downwind dispersion and concentrations. And this is pretty typical of the kinds of things that are measured in these. I had one of these big campaigns, Fort Stewart in 2022, Eglin in 2023, again at Fort Stewart in 2024, and in 2025 last year, and another one planned for Fort Stewart this year. And working closely, among other things, with the NASA FireSense, and actually last year's research burn campaign was supposed to be at Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge, which is there at Kennedy Space Center, so we could take advantage of all the high resolution weather data and balloon soundings that they have there. But Florida Peninsula went into drought, shut down the burning, or shut down the planned burn that 2 weeks ahead of time. We were able to pivot and move to Fort Stewart just because of the relationships and interest that's been built there. So this is just some imagery from that 2022 campaign, but essentially this is the similar type of data that's being gathered on all of these. So high resolution aerial imagery, as you can see in this case from the fireball imagery. Notice you can see the individual ignitions from the individual ignition spheres. It's easily, can see where the helicopter flew. You can also see these interactions between fire lines where they're starting to pull together in places where you've got flashy fuels. The same image from the GOES satellite. And here in the lower left-hand corner, just comparisons, they have a tripod set up where the fire actually burns underneath. It's measuring high resolution infrared and visible imagery of the fire. Just so we're looking at the sub-centimeter scale fire behavior all the way up to what's being measured from the canopy. So we're getting below canopy, above canopy, aircraft high resolution, all the way up to satellite for comparison. So really pretty fascinating that's going on. So I mentioned quick fire, and what you're looking at here is actually quick fire models that were run using all of the data that was collected as far as the weather, the fuels, and the ignition pattern for a couple of those burns at Fort Stewart. And so you can actually, if you look closely, you can see interactions between the fire lines where they're the different fire lines are pulling together and interacting. And so it also produces outputs for intensity or heat release. So you can see, it modeled, the fire lines pulling together here, creating a hot spot. You can see it coincides with the heavier fuels that are showing up in the fuels map. So this also down the road, and what they're working on, will have models for predicting fire effects, potentially mortality, overstored mortality, that sort of thing. So really, really promising what these next generation fire models can provide. And I mentioned quick fire. There's also quick smoke, which takes these outputs from quick fire and disperses the smoke, including, quick smoke where we had this hot spot here. It would actually model greater plume lift from that higher fire behavior in that area. So really getting higher fidelity smoke dispersion coming from these next generation models as well. Yeah, so all all or much of this falls under the umbrella of something called the Eastern Innovation Landscape Network, which is a joint uh, it's a joint effort between Department of Defense, U.S. Forest Service, Region 8 and 9, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and selected landscapes, including Fort Stewart, which you've heard me mention a number of times. These are landscapes that are interested in uh, using their fire programs and their monitoring programs to advance wildland fire science, and particularly prescribed fire science. And you'll notice Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst is one of the landscapes there in the Jersey Pine Barrens. I actually kind of pushed for that one so that it wasn't completely southeastern centric. There's a lot of burning that goes on in New Jersey, and the Pine Barrens are a really important forest type in the eastern and northeastern United States. That's where some of the worst wildfires have occurred, in that general forest type. And also, a lot of prescribed burning is going on and needs to continue going on. So there's tremendous interest there. But the Eastern Innovation Landscape Network, U.S. Forest Service actually provided a full-time position out of Region 8, works out of Fire and Aviation Management as a tech transfer specialist. DOD provides part of my time to support this through funding part of my salary, actually most of my salary. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they actually have in the southern region have a LIDAR, airborne LIDAR, which they are sharing with all of the different landscapes here to get that aerial LIDAR imagery. So really, really interesting. You can see other organizations that are interested as well. But the Eastern Innovation Landscape Network, or the EILN, facilitates workshops, but its real focus is building those connections and relationships between fire managers and the research community and modelers to make sure that the models that are being developed support the needs of the people in the field through something called co-production. So the EILN, the Eastern Innovation Landscape Network, actually stood up, I'd say was born during a workshop that coincided at Eglin Air Force Base with the 2023 campaign there. And myself and Brett Williams had a lot to do with the initial stand-up. Brett Williams had been the Wildland Fire Program Manager at Eglin Air Force Base, following behind me in that position. And he was selected as this Region 8 tech transfer specialist. And we worked together with the leadership within 3 agencies, developed a vision, and in 2023 had a workshop at Fort Stewart where we pulled in the brainiac fire modelers from Los Alamos National Lab, from universities, hosted it at Fort Stewart, pulled in managers from across the Eastern Innovation Landscape Network, and had like a solid 2-day workshop where they got to test run, provide input on development of these models. And so you can imagine getting all these fire managers in a training room for 2 straight days working with modelers. You would think that it would be just like, slow death. But the biggest comment that we got from the surveys done afterwards was that it needed to go longer. They wanted more time. They were so turned on by what was being offered by these modelers, and really engaging with them to better improve the user interface and the usability of these models. Even played a little bit with the visual reality. That's one of the things that's being some of the promise of these next generation fire behavior models, is to actually use them to develop VR training modules. That's an effort that the Eastern Innovation Landscape Network is heavily involved in. But again, with the managers and the researchers and modelers all in the same room to make sure that what's being developed valid, and it also had a good time. Just the camaraderie and the connections that are being made, where the fire manager are actually being listened to and are seeing these changes made real time in these workshops, just really builds trust and generates excitement in the promise of these next generation models. So just a quick diagram of what the EILN is looking at, really focusing on LIDAR, both aerial LIDAR and terrestrial LIDAR, and this fast fuels, which has been developed again through the DoD Wildland Fire Science Initiative, which feeds into these next generation fire behavior models like quick fire, which I talked about earlier, and again, Burn Pro 3D, which is out there, and again, we'll provide a link to that in the presentation later. And these can be used, as I mentioned, smoke modeling, fire effects, and also ecosystem modeling. There's just tremendous promise in where these next generation models can lead us. Yep, so this visual I'm about to show you is actually from an earlier study that I was actually involved with. This was about the time when I was finishing up my tenure at Eglin and moving into my current Forest Service position, but I had the opportunity to work with the Los Alamos National Lab and used FireTech. And FireTech, so this is what you're looking at is two different ways of looking at a 5-line ATV ignition in Southern Coastal Plain longleaf pine fuels. And okay, so I'll stop it right here. So you can start to see how these fire lines are starting to pull together. And notice, there's no longer head fire. Wind is going from left to right, pushing the fuels, but you're starting to build up a core of heat in this area, which also shows here. So these arrows, blues are downdrafts and reds are updrafts. You can see this convective core starting here. So if you were a firefighter on the fire line right here on this model prescribed burn, all of a sudden, instead of eating smoke, you've got the wind at your back and you're getting fresh air that's getting pulled in behind you, and you're developing a hot spot here, which is probably going to take out part of the canopy in the fuels. So you can see that hot spot really developing now. And it also models canopy consumption. That's what shows up as black here. The gray is mid-story consumption. And you can see how these fire lines interact and pull together fresh air that's being drawn in to replace what's being lifted through convection. So again, this is run by FireTech, and FireTech, again, and this was actually from back in 2013, so this is dated, but FireTech and the developer of FireTech are thoroughly embedded into these efforts funded by DoD, including Dr. Rod Lynn, the developer of FireTech that I worked with. But this actually requires supercomputers to run. The data sets are so immense, but QuickFire is a simplified version that offers very much the same kind of products, just not quite the same fidelity. So just a little bit of eye candy here. This is actually, I mentioned that we've started working with NASA's FireSense program. And on the 2025 Fort Stewart campaign, they had their aircraft flying with the AVRIS, and I forget exactly what AVRIS stands for. It's an acronym. We can't do without acronyms, but this is the kind of high resolution the aerial data that we were getting from the AVRIS camera at Fort Stewart. Really, really fascinating high resolution. And the beauty of the infrared is that you can look through the smoke. So you can really get that high resolution. And again, the aircraft is being tracked, had a GoPro, and also, the GoPro's not only measuring time and location of the aircraft, but it's also focused on the plastic sphere dispensers so that it's tracking when or if the speed is changed on how many ignition spheres are going out per acre. So all of that gets fed into the data sets that are used to evaluate and validate these models. Yeah, so this is a time lapse of the imagery. You know, the aircraft was doing loops like a racetrack, so it was coming through every few minutes. I'll just run through that again real quick for you. So you can really see those interactions, and it's going to be really interesting when this data is processed to see how closely it's matching. You can easily see these embedded wetlands in there as well, which of course, you know, all of that be included in the high resolution fuels data that's being fed into the model. So those comparisons are going to be super, super interesting when they come out. But a lot of excitement with NASA Fire Sense and a lot of really neat products. They had a major film crew, et cetera, that was there. So here, as promised, are some of the links. I have provided the presentation to Sam, and so it's available. You could hit any of these links if you wanted additional information on any of these subjects that I've touched on. And with that, anybody that's seen me present before knows I'm just hung up. I can't do without my burning question slide. So with that, I'll just take any questions that anybody might have. I know I just threw a lot of information at you, and I do also realize that I'm the only thing between you and lunch. So, but I do hope that that will generate some questions. My contact information is also there. If any of you wanted to reach out to me later, you know, be happy to chat with you or send you a link to the presentation if you would like to have it.
Thank you, James. Questions about that? I thought it was really interesting. I'm excited to see, you know, like you said, where those things develop and how long it takes us to get maybe access to some of that stuff, you know, on the ground. Thank you.
You know, the Burn Pro 3D is up and operational, and a really, really neat tool with Quickfire under the hood. And it's been funded. UC San Diego has been behind that. They've gotten a number of grants to really accelerate that as far as the user interface for prescribed fire planning. So I would certainly encourage folks to check that out. And again, Quickfire is what's running under the hood for Burn Pro 3D, but it's a pretty user-friendly interface, and they've got a network of computers that run that in the background. So anyway, just happy to have the opportunity today. And again, you know, would encourage folks to feel free to reach out if you have additional questions, if there are not any at this time.
Thank you, James. I don't see any questions. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, y'all have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, you too.